here to tell you another story about Jack and Will and Tom, and this comes from the very beginning, whenever he and his mom and his dad were all moving into the land for the very first time. Well, they had everything loaded up in their wagon, and they was just moving along, and they were going up to the promise of being able to settle in on some land and work it, and if they worked it long enough and it was productive, then they'd get to keep the land for themselves. And so they were excited about moving into the area of the king where they could get to work. Now, they had come up to where the mountains were just beginning to form, and as they got into the town, sure enough, they stopped at that store where Mr. Hemphill owned, and of course they didn't know anyone by then. Even though they saw Mr. Webster, they didn't even have a clue about who he was. But they went on in, and as Jack's daddy was getting some supplies, he mentioned that he was going up to start settling some land, and it was his plan to just go right on up the trail and up over into the foothills and up to the saddle up there in the mountains and just go right on over. And that's whenever Mr. Hemphill told him, "Oh, you don't want to do that. Why, there's a great big old nest of giants that live up there. Why, if you go up there, you're going to be in terrible trouble. No, what you're going to need to do is take this other road just as you get out of town and start going on around, go all the way around the mountain, come up over to the back side of it and come up from that side, and that way you'll be in good areas and you won't have to worry about any giants that get in the way." Well, Jack's daddy, he didn't believe about giants or none of those sorts of things, and so he went back out to the wagon with the supplies, and they loaded all up, and he started moving on down the road and started making their way up the passes. And as they got along, it was a pretty hard road, and so they didn't get there that day. The sun started to setting down, and his daddy decided to get a place for them where they could camp for the night. And as they were getting things together, collecting some wood for a fire and building them a fire ring, and his mama putting together some good food for them to cook over it, why, his daddy got to telling them those stories about supposedly there's some nest of giants up in that area, and he just wanted to tell his kids a little bit to see what kind of fantasies they were hearing. And so they kind of scared them boys a little bit. In fact, they decided that they would take turns through the whole night and make sure nothing happened to anyone. Because even if it wasn't giants, it might be something else that could come in and get what they had, and they needed everything in order to settle that land. Well, Jack's daddy stayed up and took the first chore, and he stayed up for quite a ways, and then he went over and woke up Tom, and Tom had that part of the night where you can still hear owls a-hooshing around and critters kind of moving here and there. And while Will got into that dark period of the night where you don't hear much of anything, and things are starting to quiet down, even those creatures of the evening. And then he woke up little old Jack, and why, Jack had those wee hours of the morning that are cold and still and quiet. And it doesn't take long for a little boy to get bored. And so he just started looking around for stuff to do. He found him a nice stick that he whittled out into a nice slingshot, and he got it all set up, and then he went down to the creek and he got him some stones where he could stretch it out and take a couple of good shots and loaded up his pockets. And then he started walking away from the fire and walking back to it, making sure there's plenty on it to burn, and walking out a ways and a little further each time. And he got to the point he was so far away, it just looked like a little tiny flicker down there, but there was nothing to worry about. And that's whenever he heard the first thud. At first it sounded like drums. He thought maybe it might be some Indian drums or something like that, and so it scared him a little bit, and he started moving back toward the camp so he could warn everybody that something was a-happening, even though he didn't know what it was. And that's when those drum beats started having this regular pace to them, and pretty soon he realized that it sounded almost like great big old feet falling one after another. And then he noticed that there was a pounding and things were moving a little bit. And even down there in the weeds and the willows, they started swaying back and forth. And that's for the first time whenever Jack got a sight of giants. Why, there were 4 great big old giants, and they were coming up on the other side of the creek from where his family was. Went up past them, but they was a-coming right to where Jack was. He was scared to death. Didn't know what to do. And so he just saw a tree, and he just climbed up into it. And as he was up there, he could see them giants coming on in. Well, the first one come in, he was carrying what looked like a handful of pencils. But whenever he got close enough, Jack realized he was just so big that all the firewood in his hand just looked like pencils. When he got in there, he started arranging all that firewood and making up a great big old fire. The next one coming up looked like he was carrying a little pail in his hand. But when he got closer, Jack realized he was just so big that he was carrying this great big old cauldron. He scooped it down in the creek and filled it up with water and got it sitting up on top of the fire to get to boiling. And Jack didn't have any idea what was next. But that third giant coming up looked like he had a little bit of a pet or something in his arm, but it wasn't no pet at all. When he got closer, he realized it was a great big old cow. It was just such a big giant, it looked like a little bit of a dog or something in his arms. And he went in and he plopped that whole cow right down in that cauldron so that they could make themselves some cow soup. Now, if you don't know anything about giants, you need to know that they love cow soup. They would just do just about anything for it. Of course, the farmers in the area never knowing what happened to one of their cows here or there. Sometimes they'd blame it on a wolf or maybe a pack of coyotes. Maybe it just wandered off in the woods, but anyone in that area knew the truth that there were them giants who got one every now and then because they just loved cow soup. Why, the last one that was coming on up there and getting in together, why, he looked like he was carrying a bunch of forks and spoons. And when he got closer, Jack realized he was just so big that he was carrying shovels and pitchforks, but he was just so big they looked like forks and spoons. And he was stirring up that soup a little bit. Oh, they talked and they fittered and they laid around for a little bit. And Jack didn't know what to do. He was afraid of what was going to happen. But he started to thinking to himself, I got to get myself out of this mess. And so he figured out that he'd just do what he could do. And so whenever one of those giants got up there, because they was getting ready to wanting that soup, they said, hey, brother, why don't you get up there and check it, see it's done. So he got up there, he took himself one of them pitchforks, and he jobbed it down there in that soup and spoiled it around, and he pulled himself up a great big old leg with a bit of a hoof on it, and he was about to taste it whenever Jack pulled back with that slingshot and let one rock go. Why, it hit that old leg, and it plopped it down into that cauldron, and the water splashed all up, and that giant started saying, oh, which one of you did it? Which one of you did it? Oh, you could have scalded my eye out. Oh, that was terrible. One of you other fellas get up here and you try it. See how you like getting a mess like this. Well, the second one got up there and he got a big old shovel and started scooping around there. He jobbed it in and brought him up a big old piece of cow horn, was about to taste it, whenever Jack let off another shot. Why, it hit that cow horn, plopped down in the water, it splushed all up, and that second one said, oh, my brother's right, my brother's right. One of you other two, you're the ones who's doing it. Oh, that's a terrible trick. You shouldn't be doing that. Of course, they said, we didn't do nothing. We didn't do nothing. Oh, one of you had to do it. That's what happened. And so they got that third one up there to try. Why, he got up there, he got him a pitchfork, he jobbed it down in there, pulled up that big old cow's tail, and he was about to be tasting on it whenever Jack let off another shot from that slingshot, knocked that tail off, it plopped down in the water, it went skablooshing all up, and the three of them looked at the one that was left and says, oh, you're the ones that was doing it. they jumped on him and they started fighting and rolling and biting and carrying on. And while that was happening, Jack knew his time had come. And he started coming down that tree just as fast as he could. But unbeknownst to him, as he was coming down, he put one of his feet on an old dead branch. And when he did, it went crack. And when it cracked like that, all them giants just looked right up at poor little old Jack. He froze in his tracks. Them giants got all excited. They got to moving around, and one of them reached up and plucked old Jack right out of the tree. Then they started talking about what they was going to be doing with Jack. Said, oh, we could throw him into the soup. It'd make it even better. No, we can't do that to him. We need to taste him on himself. We can get some flour and make a little dough and slide him into it. That's what we could do. And they just had all kinds of plans about how they was going to eat up old Jack. And that's whenever Jack decided that surely something had to happen. He says, oh, you don't want to eat me. I'm just a little scrawny old boy. There's hardly anything on me for you to eat. Why, I got hardly nothing but skin and bones. Why, what you need is someone bigger and someone healthier and someone that could do you good. You giants, you got a hearty appetite. And them giants said, oh, this boy's right. Why, look at him. He got nothing hardly about him. Why, he might not even be good to flavor the cow soup. And they said, oh, he wasn't like them Kingsmen. Remember the day when we used to get into the Kingsmen? Why, they was plump and they was tasty. And they were remembering and reminiscing all about those Kingsmen whenever Jack said, oh, fellas, how come you don't get them no more? They said, oh, the king has built this great, big, terrible wall all around his place. It's bigger and higher. We can't get up over it. And it's great, big, and thick, and we can't knock it down. And we can't even dig up underneath it. Can't believe how the king had got something so big and so horrible. And so, since we can't get them, I guess we'll just have to eat you. And Jack says, oh, I know what you ought to do. You ought to take me up to that terrible wall. I'm just a little old fella, and why, you could just throw me up and over it. And when I land on the other side, I could open up the doors for you, and you could come on in, and why, you could get all the king's men you wanted. Now, giants aren't very clever, and so they started to thinking about how this was a fantastic plan. They just picked up Jack, they left their soup a-boiling, and they took off toward the king's wall. Why, Jack had never gone so fast in his entire life. He'd never been so high to look out over the land as he was when them giants was a-carrying him along. And when they got there, they said, oh, you got to keep your word, boy, we'll eat you up. And they took old Jack and they throwed him up to the top. Why, he went real high up to that wall, but instead of falling over, he fell right on top. He hurt himself and rolled a bit, but he was a tough little old boy, and so he got up, looked up over the wall and said, hey, I think I'm okay. I'm going to go down here and see if I can't get the door open. And the giant said, hurry up, boy, hurry up. We got to get on in there. Hurry up. And so Jack went down and he rattled on the gates, and them giants were going, hurry up, hurry up. He says, oh, I can't get it. I'm just a little old boy. I'll have to go get me something to see if I can't get it to working for me. I need a pry bar or something. I'm just too little to get it on my own. He said, well, that's okay, boy. That's okay. You go find something, but find it quick. Why, Jack started to going, and as he started to moving around, why, he saw kingsmen here and there. They was a-sleeping and they was a-snoring and they wasn't a-moving a bit because they were safe and secure inside their walls. And Jack got to moving on up through them, got all the way up to the king's house, and why, no one even stopped him. It was too early in the morning for getting up, and he just went right on in the front door because it wasn't locked because everyone was safe and secure. Why, when he got into that bottom level, he heard the worst sound he'd ever heard. Why, he got to hurting his ears, and he went to go look to see what that terrible sound was, and when he opened up a big old door, there was the king in his bed. sleeping and a snoring. Sounded like a great big old monster of some sort, and Jack knew that he wasn't about to wake him up, and so he went on up to the next level, and that's when he heard this screeching, terrible noise. It was a hurting on his ears, but he thought maybe he might find something in there. And when he opened it up, there was the queen, and she was a-sleeping and a-snoring, and just this high pitch of a thing, and it just hurt his ears. And so he went on up to the third level, and when he got up there, he heard the most beautiful music he'd heard in his whole life. Why, it just made his heart patter a little bit, and he decided he had to find out what that music was all about, and he started walking down this hallway. But as he was going along, he noticed on the wall a great big old silver sword. And under the sword, there was this big old vial of stuff that looked sort of greenish gold in the middle of it. And then there was this plaque that said, "Whoever loves the princess, whoever can drink the drink, he can use the sword." Now, Jack didn't know what that meant, and so he just went on down to find the music, and whenever he opened the door, there was none other than the king's daughter a-sleeping and a-snoring. When her snores came out, it was just like music to poor old Jack's ears. He'd look to her, and his heart would patter, and he'd look away, and it'd slow back down, and it'd speed up, and then it'd slow back down. Why, Jack knew right then and there he loved the princess. And so he was determined to get back there and see if he couldn't use that silver sword to get himself out of this mess. He first of all picked up that old vial, and he just gulped it on down. It sort of went into his mouth like a raw egg. It sort of swirled up and nearly caught him where he couldn't breathe, and then it just went on through like an old raw oyster. Why, after it was all good, he got to where he was a little woozy a bit, and he fell right down on the floor. He knew right then and there he was about to die. He started to break out into a sweat, and then he got to feeling a little better. He got himself up. He reached up to that old silver sword, and it just come right off the wall. He could move it around. Didn't feel like it had no weight to it at all. He says, "Oh, I know what I'm going to do now." Why, Jack made his way down through the king's house and out through the king's men, and as he got down close to that gate, he rattled on it again, and sure enough, them giants started saying, "Oh boy, he's back, he's back. Come on, boy, open up that gate, open up that gate." And Jack said, "Oh, I can't get it open. But I noticed a smaller gate just up the ways here, and you'll have to scooch through on your bellies, but I can get that one open." And so they went on down the walls a ways, and Jack got to that little old gate, and he got it up, and the first giant got down. He had to get on his belly and just sort of scooch his way through, and whenever his head came out, he looked at Jack, and Jack had that great big old silver sword, and he went ka-whopping down. Why, he yelled back over, and he said, "Oh, this one's got stuck. He's stuck in there. You're going to have to push him on through." So the second one pushed him on through. And whenever he came out, Jack went ka-whopping down again. The third one, the same thing. And then the fourth one, with all that ka-whopping and all of that screaming and all of that hollering, why, it woke up the king's men, and they woke up the king, and they had everybody down there, and they had seen this little old boy who was carrying the silver sword, and he had just cleaned out a whole nest of giants. Why, the men gathered around him, and they said, "Oh, the king is going to want to talk to you." And so Jack got his way in there, carrying his sword, and he got up there, and he told his tale to the king, and the king says, "Oh, why, I'm glad you boys are around here. In fact, I'm going to make sure your daddy gets some of the best land around whenever we sort all of this out." Jack said he'd appreciate that, knew his daddy would appreciate that. But he says, "How come you with that sword?" He says, "Well, I just followed what the word said. It said if I loved the princess and could drink the drink, well, I could use it, and so that's what I did." And all the king's men said, "Oh, that's just not the way it should be. Why, Well, we probably loosened it up when we'd been trying to, and it's just not fair. Well, the king thought about it and said, well, I guess we could put it up and try it again. So they all went upstairs, and they put up the sword back where it was, and the king's men all tried one after another, but they couldn't even begin to want to drink the drink, and since Jack had already drunk it up, there was nothing for them to get. And they couldn't pull that silver sword off the wall with all of their might and all of their strength and everything they tried. But whenever it came through, Jack just reached up and pulled it right off. Why, he put it back up again and decided that was probably a good place to keep it, because a little old boy doesn't need a great big old weapon like that all the time. But the king brought him down and started to talking to him and said, oh, I can't believe what you've done. Why, my men got scared to death of them giants. We had to build a great big old wall to protect us. There was nothing we could do against them but just stay away, and here you go and get rid of all of them. Why, we can't believe what you did, and we are so thankful for what you did. Why, whenever Jack got back to his family and he told him his wild tale, they couldn't believe it either. But sure enough, when they got up to their land, the king had sent out some messengers and took them to the very choicest land in the area that they would get to use and get to be for their own place one day. And that's the story of how Jack encountered his very first giants. Now, I told you that story because there are giants, huge things in our lives, and there are good things that we can use to overcome them. So don't let anything keep you from doing what is right.